Hello, everybody. So for today's video, we're going to look at the causes of the Great Depression and the initial response to it under President Herbert Hoover. Now, before we can actually talk about the Depression, we need to go a little bit further back to actually the beginning of the 1920s. All three of the presidents during the 1920s, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, are pro-business Republicans. And ultimately, they leave a stamp on the presidency during this time period that creates policies that in the long run will produce the Depression. Um, and it starts with Warren G. Harding when he's elected in 1920. When Harding is elected in 1920, the country had just got out of the First World War. The first Red Scare was still kind of in its death throes at that point. There had been mass labor unrest. There was high unemployment. And basically, people really were just kind of exhausted from the, kind of chaos of the final years of the Wilson administration, had largely lost faith in progressive reform, and championed, as Harding campaigned on, a quote, return to normalcy. Now, what he meant by normalcy was not exactly spelled out, but basically the idea was that, the kind of experimental phase in American government, the kind of um, watchful eye that Wilson and other progressives had advocated would be kind of going the other way. And he proceeded to do exactly that. As president, Harding uh, slashed taxes on the wealthy, he raised tariffs on imported goods, and generally promoted pro business policies that were designed to create prosperity. And in the short run, they did. Manufacturing, fueled by a new consumer culture, which would completely change American society during the 1920s. And from that point onward, would ultimately bring about the economic prosperities. It's why people oftentimes refer to the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties. Um, but Harding was also, in addition to being a very pro-business president, he was also very corrupt. He surrounded himself with a lot of people from his background in Ohio, a lot of his cronies from Ohio. And ultimately, just before he died while in office of a heart attack in 1923, he was implicated and embroiled in this scandal known as the Teapot Dome scandal, which involved the illegal leasing of oil reserves in Wyoming, Teapot Dome, Wyoming, which is why it's called that, by the Secretary of the Interior. So his presidency is one that's relatively short. It's filled with some scandals, including some salacious rumors that eventually would be proven, like the fact that he fathered an illegitimate child with one of his mistresses. Um, Notice I use the word mistresses plural. Um, and the guy who succeeds him, Calvin Coolidge, could not have been any different if he tried to. Coolidge, who came from this very strict religious upbringing, was nicknamed Silent Cal because he spoke so rarely. And he assumes the presidency from Harding in 1923 when he dies suddenly. And Coolidge, to his credit, does try to distance himself from a lot of the corruption that had characterized the Harding administration. He, really tries to, portray himself as he generally was, as morally upright and, not a tool, or not being, bought out by anybody or anything like that. He was also much more supportive of racial equality and tolerance than many in the time period were. So that's another plus for him. Um, but he did share Harding's general philosophy. He may have found Harding loathsome personally, and may have, disliked the corruption that surrounded him, but he generally shared his limited government philosophy, which was much more akin to the laissez-faire governance of the Gilded Age. And Coolidge in particular was a kind of fanatical supporter of free markets. He famously said the business of America is business, and he said, you know, the man who builds a factory is a god, and the people who work there worship there, basically, which is, pretty extreme way to frame building, to praise factory owners, comparing them to a deity. But anyway, so he continues the generally deregulatory policies of Harding. He slashes taxes for the wealthy. His Supreme Court issues rulings that rule minimum wage laws unconstitutional and generally curb the ability of workers to organize and form unions. So it's a period that sees, on the one hand, spectacular economic growth, but it's underwritten by these economic policies that generally make it harder for people to, stay afloat and to have, a real say in the workplace. He ultimately decides not to run for a second term in office, technically a third term, because he finished up part of Harding's term. And instead, in 1928, the Republicans nominate Herbert Hoover. Hoover ends up winning the election in 1928 against Democrat Al Smith, not so much by because his economic policies differ with Smith, they don't, but by primarily playing up the still pretty significant anti-Catholic sentiment that had crested a few years earlier, but was still pretty potent in the U.S. at the time period. Hoover was actually much more in line with the progressive wing of the Republican Party than either Coolidge or Harding. He'd been in charge of the American Red Cross during World War I and helped spearhead relief efforts in Europe during and immediately after the conflict. And after World War I, he was made Secretary of Commerce under both the Harding and Coolidge administrations. And so he was a very well-known figure when he's elected president in 1928. He's someone many Americans held in very high esteem, coming from a relatively impoverished background as an orphan, and becoming this, very well-known person, this very well-known, in some ways, very well-known humanitarian figure. But by the time Hoover assumes office, the effects of the policies of the previous 9 years were beginning to have an effect on the American and eventually the global economy. Basically, the 1920s are an economic mirage. They're a period where it appears the economy's going great, where it appears that there's widespread prosperity, but in many instances it is largely an illusion. And there's a couple of sources of this illusion. The first is that the sale of consumer goods does remain very high throughout the decade. The emergence of new mass production techniques like the moving assembly line pioneered for the use in the automotive industry by Henry Ford, and various other mass production techniques make it so that there's this new plethora of consumer goods, like cars and radios and refrigerators, and the like, that there is this very strong demand for in the United States. And the emergence of those new mass production technologies coincides with the emergence of modern advertising as a medium. in the United States. And so out of this emerges this new consumer culture in the US during the 1920s, where one's social standing increasingly becomes tied to what you own, or in some cases, what you don't own. And basically, for many Americans, this becomes sort of an obsession, this whole idea of keeping up with the Joneses, this idea of maintaining the appearance of prosperity and affluence by buying stuff, basically. And so for many Americans, this new consumer culture becomes a central element of their social conception of themselves during the 1920s, which is a very new development. Prior to the 1920s, most Americans have this very kind of, if I can't afford it, I don't need it kind of attitude, or I'll make do with what I have kind of attitude. That kind of frontier individualistic ethos, I guess you could say. That had largely disappeared by the 1920s, and so you have this new materialistic, consumer-driven economy, consumer-driven basis of the economy that becomes the engine for that economy going forward, and remains so today by and large. Consumer spending still comprises something like 70% of GDP in the United States to this day. So, still a very, very important element of the U.S. economy overall is consumer spending and purchasing. The problem with this is that although some people see increases in wages and their standard of living, particularly the white collar managerial class, much larger segments of American society either find themselves worse off than they were prior to the 1920s, or basically just barely keeping their heads above water. For farm workers, for example, the aftermath of World War I and the collapse of the international agricultural market that war helped fuel and which benefited the United States, leads to a dramatic increase in the numbers of foreclosures in rural America, a part of the country that, it's also worth mentioning, is still largely making do without modern conveniences like electricity and running water and indoor plumbing and things like that. So for some parts of American society, the 1920s are a period where they are decidedly worse off than they were in decades before. For other parts of American society, they're basically just getting by. Many working class Americans, factory workers, people who work in various industries, they don't see their wages increase during the 1920s. This is due again to a combination of slashing taxes for the very wealthy, and other things that help the wealthy dramatically build their fortunes, but also, again, a generally anti-worker, anti-labor sentiment in government that makes it difficult for workers to form true grassroots unions during this time period that might secure for them better wages or working conditions. And so as a result of this, economic inequality grows rapidly throughout the 1920s, to the point that by 1929, the top 1% in the United States control control more economic resources than the bottom 42%, nearly the bottom half of the country combined. And in addition to that, you also have inequality in other areas as well. Not only do you have income inequality between working class Americans and the wealthy, but you also have inequality in trade. The United States comes out of World War I virtually unscathed materially. It certainly loses a lot fewer people on the battlefields of World War I than many other countries, but it also comes out of the war in a much stronger economic position than most countries, not just the countries that it defeated, but also its allies as well. But because of the growing isolationism and the growing withdrawal of the United States from the international community that follows World War I, the United States does not, by and large, commit itself to rebuilding Europe after World War I, which leaves Europe and many other parts of the world in very dire straits. They already have extensive debts left over from the First World War. In some instances, like in France, their physical landscape has been permanently scarred by the war. And so basically, um, when it comes to foreign trade and promoting rebuilding, the United States basically does the worst thing it can do at the end of after World War One. It refuses to help rebuild the economies of European countries, and it also raises tariffs on goods coming into the U.S. from those countries, which makes it, of course, more difficult for those countries to sell their goods on the American market. And so basically, you get this situation by 1929 that is incredibly volatile. Um, by 1929, that foreign trade begins to grind to a standstill. That's because, again, many of these countries that the U.S. depends on for its trade in Europe, um, they can't buy American goods the way that they want to, or the way American businesses want them to. And so what they do is they take on even more debt by borrowing even more money from American banks, to which they're already in many cases deeply in debt. Well, by 1929, they're at a point where they can no longer take on any additional debt. And so the demand for American goods internationally begins to drop sharply at that point, which of course leads to the first waves of factories laying off workers because there's no longer this international demand. There's no longer a need to make as many goods, so there's no longer a need for as many workers. Um, on top of that, you also have the inequality here at home. As I mentioned, during the 1920s, you have this consumer culture emerging, where material possessions and the status that they confer become a central element in American society. The problem is many people's wages had remained effectively stagnant throughout the decade. The way that people compensated for this initially is kind of similar to what a lot of people do today. They buy things on credit. You can't afford to buy that new radio set for your living room. At this point, it's worth mentioning that radios were basically pieces of furniture that took up massive amounts of space. You want to buy that new radio, but can't afford it. Want to buy that new car, but can't afford it. That's okay. You can buy it on installment. And many people do. They buy these consumer goods that are seen increasingly as necessities, and in some cases are, in the case of automobiles, and they buy them that way, even though in many cases they're already stretched terribly thin because of the stagnating wages that they're being paid. This isn't universally true. There are some manufacturers like Henry Ford who pay their workers actually more than the industry standards for their industries because they recognize that, you know, in Henry Ford's own words, one's own workers are one's best consumers. But not everybody recognizes this. Most people don't recognize this. And as a result, many workers, if they want to buy the expensive goods that they're making, they have to they have to buy things on credit. They have to take out to do these installment buying things. By 1929, many of these people can no longer afford to buy additional goods, which of course presents a massive problem because you have a consumer economy that's rapidly running out of consumers. Um, and so that brings me to the third and final point that finally brings the Depression um, into being, which is the stock market. The stock market, like foreign trade, like domestic wages, is likewise affected by deregulation, pro-business policies at the expense of workers, and economic inequality. The stock market grows rapidly throughout the 1920s. This is actually a major plot component of the book The Great Gatsby. That's how Jay Gatsby makes his money, by engaging in basically legalized gambling on the stock market. Um, it's implied with some help from underworld associates. Um, but anyway, um, so the stock market grows massively throughout the 1920s. And many people want a piece of the pie. They want to get rich by engaging in this basically legalized gambling on the stock market, this highly speculative buying and selling of stocks. The problem is, again, much like that fancy car or that new radio that people want, most people can't actually afford to buy stock on Wall Street in a manner that'll actually, produce dividends for them, actually make them rich. Um, and so, without substantial government regulation, without any meaningful oversight of the stock market, um, Wall Street brokers come up with a new means to encourage and enable everyday people to basically play the stock market game. And that is through something known as margin buying. Basically, what margin buying means is it, or buying on the margin, same thing, just different ways of phrasing it. Um, Basically, what you do is, say you want to buy, I don't know, 100 shares in General Motors, and those shares are going for around $5 a share. That's just an example. I don't know what the actual price of General Motors stock was in 1929. But anyway, so say you want to buy 100 shares of General Motors stock, and those stocks are going for $5 a share, but you only got $50 that you can spend on stock. Well, if you buy on margin, what ends up happening is a stockbroker will front the remainder of the money for the stock for you. And so long as the stock continues building value, you will continue to collect a dividend. You'll continue to collect money. The catch is that although you're only putting up a 10% or 20% or a quarter of the value of the stock up front, if the stock loses value, you're responsible not just for that portion that you've put up, you're responsible for the entirety of it. And when the stock goes down, then you receive something which everybody dreads, which is known as a margin call, where somebody calls you and demands payment for the entire value of the stock. So this is basically a very dangerous way of buying and selling stock that pretty much assumes that the economy will keep booming, that stocks will keep rising in value, and that the economy will never go south. Well, of course it goes south. The combination of the decline in international trade, the continued devastation of the agricultural economy in the U.S., the decline in consumer spending brought about by economic inequality, all of these things finally intrude upon the fantasy of a booming economy in the stock market in October of 1929. And the market hesitates in late October. There's a day of frenzied selling on October 24th, known as Black Thursday. And that selling frenzy, as people are desperately trying to offload the stock so that they can avoid that margin call, so they can avoid being on the hook for these now worthless stocks, that culminates 5 days later on October 29th in what's known as Black Tuesday, when the stock market, the New York Stock Exchange, loses more money more value in a single day than at any point in its history. And it's this event, the collapse of the stock market, that proves to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's not in and of itself the event that causes the depression. There are other underlying issues, including, like I said, economic inequality, unequal foreign trade, lax regulation, and oversight that caused the Great Depression. It's just that the collapse of the stock market is the final straw. It's the last thing that kind of dispels the illusion of a booming economy. You know, This is a lesson that is to repeatedly be told to people in American history, especially in the last 20 years. But markets are not the true economy. And 1929 illustrated that quite graphically when the stock market collapse finally, you know, when the stock market finally caught up with the reality of what was happening in the country at large. So basically, then the question is, how is this going to be? How are people going to stop this? How are we going to stop this from turning into what it does eventually become, a massive global depression? And the answer to that, or what many people hope is the answer to that, is in the hands of President Herbert Hoover. Many at the time were happy that he was president. They thought, okay, this is scary, but with Hoover in office, this guy knows what he's doing, we'll be okay. Unfortunately, that particular mindset would prove to be mistaken. And over the next several years, Hoover would take actions that would not only make the Depression considerably worse, but also his refusal to take certain actions would create a wave of growing militancy amongst working class Americans that eventually would threaten law and order and, basically everything in the United States as a result of the Great Depression. And that's what I'll talk about in the next video.